Hi, everybody. How's it going? We are going to get started today. I'm just gonna wait 1 second. There is a little bit of lag and I want to make sure we're all set up. Great, perfect. It seems like we are all set. So hi, nice to see you all again. This is storytelling for high schoolers. And what that really means, I addressed it a little bit last week, but in case we have anybody new, is storytelling as a verbal medium, which involves writing, involves crafting a story. For those of you who listen to storytelling podcasts like The Moth, or anybody who really enjoys stand-up comedy, what we're going to be studying in the next few weeks is in that vein of another way of looking at it is taking an anecdote and turning it into a story. So last week, we looked at two pieces from The Moth, Bad Haircut and Taken for a Ride. And we sort of gave an overview, right, of what story is and how those pieces are essential to storytelling. So this week, we're going to look at those pieces again, and then I promise that next week we'll move on to something new. But I think it's important, especially if we have anybody new, for us all to really start on the same page. But we're going to dive in with a little more specificity. So first, I need to give a little bit of background, but it won't take too long, I promise. So last week, we decided that the things that really mattered, or I decided, I guess, the things that really mattered in the stories as we watched them were that they had a real narrative structure, right? A beginning, a middle, and an end. That they incorporated a lot of character, right? Those are two of the big points that we made at that point. The other things that we talked about were sort of the conflict, but mostly within that regard, we talked about the technical aspects of storytelling, the way we use foreshadowing, the way we call back to something. And as we move forward, we're going to work on those specific sort of tricks. But today, I really want to focus on the narrative structure because it's very basic, it's very simple, but I think it is the thing that takes an anecdote or something that happened and can turn it into a story, which is to say, you don't have to have exactly a narrative structure, but if you don't have something organizing your story, it's not that people notice, oh, there was no beginning, middle, or end, or, oh, there was no narrative structure, but they will notice that something's missing. I think that's when stories become what we think of as rambling or stories without a point. So if you weren't with us last week, we're looking at the same pieces. And if you were with us, I think there's still something to learn because we're going to, rather than sort of experiencing them in one go, really pull them apart. And I think this will make it faster as we move forward with new pieces in the 3 sessions to follow. And hopefully leave you guys with a really good place to start on your own stories. Because you all have stories and they need to be told, and nobody is better to tell them than you. So let's talk about this, the narrative structure. It's the most basic and probably important piece of storytelling. We talked about it last week as the beginning, middle, end, which is the narrative structure. And it follows a traditional art that we call the dramatic structure, which I will show you guys what we typically look at that as. So I'm going to share my screen and show you this, which is Freytag's pyramid. So forgive me if a lot of you have seen this before. I think there's still a lot to get out of it. So Gustav Freytag was a playwright, writer, poet in the 19th century. And he basically looked at this as narrative structure. So this area right here, the exposition, inciting incident, that's what we call the beginning, right? That's the beginning of our story. The exposition is really the background of the story. It's what you need to know in order to follow the rest of the train. The inciting incident is the event that hooks your reader in, or listener in this case, that causes the rest of the story to unfold. In audio stories, like the ones we listened to last week and are going to listen to again in a moment. What's great about the verbal storytelling medium is that often this moment, the inciting incident, is met with a gasp or laughter from the audience, or a moment of them telling you that they are hooked, right? That they know that something's going to happen. And that's one of the advantages of telling a story or reading something out loud. You'll note that when we look at them. So the rising actions is all of the decisions and events that lead to the story's climax, right? So this is, once we have the inciting incident, then whatever our character decides to do is leading us up here, right, to the climax. And in there is the complication. The complication is when the storyteller is reacting to all the events of the rising action and trying to resolve or get through it. So don't worry, I'm kind of rushing through this, and then we're going to slow it way down when we get to our examples. Then we have the climax. The climax is the turning point. It's the highest moment of tension. Some people think of the climax as the thing that happens. Some people argue that it's the moment that we're aware something's going to happen. That moment of tension, that moment of what could possibly happen next? Where is this going to go? And we're going to discuss how that might work in our two examples. But for the purposes of this conversation, think of it as the turning point. Nothing will be the same after this. The reversal is when something shifts on a dime. I like to think of it as the realization of the climax. Very often it's when our narrator, which is you, is made aware of the shift, of the change, of the fact that nothing will be the same. The falling action is where the main parts of the story starts to come to a close. So everything that led us here is starting to wind down in the falling action, which leads us to the resolution, which is pretty much what it sounds like, which is then something is resolved. And then this fancy word here is the denouement. The denouement is where things are explained or resolved. And you'll note that the denouement doesn't always exist in stories. It's not always clear. And we'll discuss that again in our actions. But there are many examples in literature of sort of wrapping things up. Great example for anybody who's familiar with it is Edith Wharton's Age of Innocence. We get that final chapter where the narrator's older and sort of looking back, and the events of the novel have already occurred, and we see where things went. And that's a great denouement. But then there are other novels that just end really suddenly, maybe even without the resolution. So the important thing to know about Freytag's pyramid is that it is a tool accessible to you. It can help you craft your beginning and middle and end. It is not the only tool. It is not the only option. And you don't have to follow every single piece of it exactly. And as you'll see, the stories that we're going to look at today don't necessarily follow it exactly. But it can be really helpful, especially when you're first starting out, and especially when you're working on the first draft of a story, to see how much you can use of it. Because then you can play with it. Then you can throw things away. Then you can say, I don't need the denouement. Then you can say the inciting incident is actually going to come right before the climax. But start with this solid foundation, and then you can play around. So that's why we're starting with Freytag's pyramid, even though a lot of you, I'm sure, already know it. I've already worked with it. But it's good to go back to the basics, I think. I often use this little pyramid just to check and make sure anything's happening in my story. So I think it's a really important thing to do. So we are going to look at our two examples from last week. Sorry, that is my dog. He is a guest teacher on this. So let's look at our examples. We're going to start with the bad haircut. And I know we're really sinking into these, and I promise you that we're about to expand. And I know that these have more of a comedic bent than maybe some of the stories that you feel like you're here to tell. And that is why we have multiple classes, is so that we can move forward and figure this out. Mostly what I ask is that you focus on the lesson for today when we look at these stories. I really want you to be thinking about that pyramid we just looked at, about the beginning, the middle, end, about the narrative structure. And my assistant professor is back. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're going to start and stop this time. For those of you who were not tuning in last week, I recommend you maybe pause here, or at your leisure, sort of go back and watch the whole thing through so you can have the authentic story receiving experience. But for today, we're going to start and stop. And we're just sort of going to see what happens. We're going to see how much we can fit it in. Okay, so we are sharing this screen. Let's see if we can get it in full screen. Great. Okay, so let's listen. And the thing that we are listening to right away is just, where is the exposition, right? Where's the beginning of this?
Okay, so I'm in 4th grade, going to 5th grade, and it's the end of the summer, and I'm getting ready for school. And I got my school supplies, my school clothes, my super cool new lunchbox, the new J's on my feet, you know, the new Jordan sneakers. I'm set. There's only really one thing I'm missing. And you know how, like, when you're a kid, you don't really care how your hair looks? Like, you don't really take care of your hair. Like, you don't really comb it or wash it. Or maybe that's just me. So at the end of the summer.
So exposition, right? It's about to be school. I'm all set. I have everything I need. I have cool new sneakers. I look great. We have all of this background information now so that we know wherever the story goes next, what we need to know about the character. So even in this very casual colloquial storytelling, the exposition's there. It matters. You need your reader, listener to have a foundation for them to go with you on. So
my hair was kind of just like this thing on my head. And it was terrible. It was revolting. Like, nobody wanted to look at it. And so everywhere I'm going, my friends are like, yo, Alfonso, you need a haircut. My sister is telling me you need a haircut, you know. My mom's kind of corny. She said, I'm going to get you a haircut before you go to school because you look like a fool. You know, that's what she said. And so one day, and I'm kind of just like, yeah, you know, I agree. I need a haircut. So one day I go to my cousin's house, and it's my older cousin and my other cousin around my age. And so I'm sitting there, I'm playing video games with my other cousin around my age, and while I'm playing video games, I kind of notice my older cousin kind of staring at my hair. And all of a sudden he says, you know, I could cut your hair right for free.
Okay, right? So we have our inciting incident, which is this idea of he needs the haircut. That is the momentum of the story, is our realization that he needs the haircut. Quickly followed by, and probably aligned with, his cousin saying, I will cut it for free. That is the moment that the story takes off. The exposition's done. We get it. We're going to school. We're trying to look our best. And we need this haircut. And now my cousin's going to give it to me. Inciting incident, right? Like, now we know. If he says now, so my mom took me to the hairdresser, we might think that it's not going to go well, but probably we assume, okay, this is a hairdresser. And you've heard stories like that where somebody sort of says, oh, I really need a haircut. So my mom took me to the hairdresser and they cut my hair. And that's the story. Because it doesn't have the inciting incident. It doesn't have this moment of, I can cut it for free.
And I'm like, really? Really? Because that'd be great. My mom's been she said I need a haircut before I go back to school. So this would be awesome. And so I didn't really know better. Like, nobody was there to say, stop. This guy is not a licensed barber. He's not qualified to cut hair. This is not what he does. It's just not. And so my cousin takes me to the backyard, to the garage. And the garage is dark, and there's not really much light except for this old rusty lamp. And you know how, like, in the movies when they find some ancient artifact and there's the dust on it and they blow it and the dust fly everywhere? That was that lamp. That was it. So my cousin, you know, starts cutting my hair. there was no mirrors either, you know. And you know how like when you go to a barber shop, there's these giant mirrors. So while you're getting your haircut, you could kind of look up and check, you know, I like that. That's nice, you know. There was none of that. So my cousins cut my hair for like 25, 30 minutes. And all of a sudden, he stops. And he's proud of his work. He's like, bang, there you go. I got you, little man. Gives me a high five. Got you. And I get up, you know, I'm like, okay, now I'm ready for school. You know, I want to go play video games with my cousin now.
So all through that, right, we've got the rising action, which is the getting of the haircut, sitting down, getting it done. The complications that we talked about, he lays out for us in all of the clues that this is not going to go well, right? The artifact of a tool to cut his hair, the no mirrors. And note that complications in oral storytelling are also heard in the audience, right? When he says 25, 30 minutes, everyone laughs because their point is, okay, that's way too long. Like, what is happening? So another great thing about storytelling as a verbal format is that it gives us the opportunity to check to make sure what we have decided as the complications to our rising action are working, that they are serving as complications to it, not just irrelevant parts of the anecdote. The climax is right here, is where the haircut's done and he's about to go out in the world. And we know, given all the information that the storyteller has provided for us, that this is probably not good, right? We know. So it's that moment of tension. It's that moment of like, oh my God, what happened to his hair?
And so I knew there was something wrong. Because as soon as I stepped foot into the house, my other cousin around my age looks at me and starts dying, crying, laughing all over the place, hysterically. And I like jokes, you know, I want to know what's funny too. So I go to the bathroom and I come face to face with the mirror. I couldn't believe what I saw, guys.
So again, we heard it from the audience, that moment of reversal that landed with them. I looked in the mirror. Everything we know is about to be different. We're about to realize what happened in the climax. Because sometimes you don't know, your narrator doesn't know, the story, the person in the story doesn't know we're at the climax. This is the moment where, oh, that was the climax. And you know that because somebody in the audience goes, oh my God, as we just heard.
My hairline was back here. And this was all shining. Like I had like this windshield thing going on. Like if you look closely enough into my forehead, you can see your own reflection in it. It was crazy. It was just glistening. And I was kind of crazy when I was a kid. So I started bugging out all over the place. You know, I'm screaming everywhere. Why? What am I going to do? Oh my God, cousin, why have you wronged me this way? How am I supposed to go to school? What am I going to do?
Falling action, right? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to do? I have to try and solve everything that just led me here. It's the pursuit, one could say, of like getting back, getting to the before.
Later on, I get dropped off at my house and I see my mom. And she looks at me and she kind of just like shrugs it off, you know. She's like, oh, well, you know, I told you I was going to get you a haircut. Should have waited, now you're going to look funny. And so that's what happened. I looked funny for the first 2 to 3 weeks of school. People laughed and made jokes. And
so there you go. The resolution, right? That's what happened. His mom told him, this is what's going to occur. You are going to look funny at school. Now this has a denouement. So let's listen.
I don't know if y'all can tell. I keep it fresh. So basically, I trusted my cousin once, and I will never trust him again for anything.
Okay, see, so we have the denouement in that story of, so yeah, I looked funny, but now I always have a really good haircut and I never trusted my cousin again. That is the winding down of the action. We had the resolution, which is there is no solution. You're just going to go to school. You're just going to look funny. And the denouement is everything that happens after. Story's totally over. Story's totally done. The resolution occurred. And there's still more for me to say. So I think this is a boring way to have to break down a funny story, right? It is, for sure. But I think his story is funnier because the narrative structure is there, because he gives it that arc. So we as the listeners can travel with him and have these moments of recognition of what the experience is and of what's happening. Which is to say, you don't want your story to pass the Freytag test because it's such a fresh and interesting test. But you want to have it because people will appreciate it even if they know that they don't know that they do. Then, once you have that structure, you can play with it. Think about the characters he gives us, the situations he puts us in. He really puts his personality in it. It's not enough to just have the structure. But without the structure, without making sure that your story is rising in action, is having a climax, is having a reversal, is falling in action, you're in danger of just telling the story, as I said last week, that doesn't sound inherently interesting. When I was going into 5th grade, I got a really bad haircut from my cousin. That's the same story, right? That's the actual story we just heard. But it lacks the structure that turns it from anecdote, something bite-sized to share, into a real narrative, into a storytelling opportunity. So if last week you came up with 3 stories, as I suggested, and you kind of looked at them and you're like, well, these are short. Maybe this week, what you could do is give them the pyramid, give them that structure, see what you can build out, right? You can pause in moments. You can really, really hang in them. And the moment of climax is a great place to stick for a second. The haircut is over. What is happening? I'm going to go see the rest of my cousins. Everyone is making the space. We are living in that moment of suspension. This is what you can do when you know what your story is trying to say, when you know what your story is trying to achieve. It's all just tools, you know, and we'll talk about it. We'll talk about the stories we read in the next few weeks that don't do it as much, that really play around with it, that maybe start at the climax. But let's listen to our second piece from last week, Taken for a Ride. And just because I think it's important to see how often this structure comes up and how it doesn't make it sound the same. It doesn't make it sound boring if multiple stories really suit this structure, because you are the storyteller and you are unique. And that's going to be the most important thing. And your story is going to be unique. The structure just gives it a really nice base. It just gives it a place to jump off from. So let's take a look at our second story. And once again, we're kind of going to start and stop and, you know, figure it out.
Everybody. Good evening, everyone. Thank you. My story has to do with a 1996 Grand Marquis Mercury. That I picked up from my father when he bought a new car. I got it when my daughter was in high school so that I could have a second car to get her to and from school. And we had a brief relationship. I got this car about 5 years ago, and it was pretty reliable. But the main part of the story has to do with the time that I got the car stolen and how I got the car stolen. I live in Detroit. I've been a lifelong Detroit resident. I'm third generation Detroit. I'm not easily bamboozled. I'm not easily scammed. I see panhandlers and people trying to get you at the gas station for a couple of bucks. But this guy was good.
Okay, so here we have exposition, but exposition that tells us what's going to happen, as we discussed last week. That is really great and hard to do storytelling device, which is, here is what is going to happen, right? Even in our first story, he doesn't say right away, so I got this terrible haircut. He starts with, so school's about to start, I'm looking good, I'm excited. The title gave it away a little bit, sure, but if you were just listening to that story, you're not totally sure where it's going to go. Here, we know this car's going to get stolen. But we have exposition around that, right? This is a story about the car. This is I got it because I need to drive my daughter. And then, very key, very important exposition. I am from Detroit. I am not easily bamboozled. I am used to this. So not only now do we know the car's going to get stolen, but he has said to us, I am not somebody who you'd think this would happen to. And exposition is the stuff that is important for your listener to know to go forward in the story. And I think for the sake of his story, we need to know that he really had to get tricked for this to happen, because that will inform how we listen to the rest of the story. And now we're about to hit, by the way, our inciting incident to see if you can find it.
This guy was real good. He got it. I'm loading tools in the car to go to my dad to do a little work. Guy comes up and says, can you help me? I right away say no. No, I got a couple bucks. I just need you to give me a ride over and get my car a job. Now, most of the time, people are trying to scare you. They don't have $2 in their hand offering it to you.
So, inciting incident. Can you come help me start my car? The complication is the $2, right? He says what made this different for me, somebody who knows how to anticipate this stuff, who knows to be worried about it, who knows to look out for it, is usually these guys don't have a couple of dollars. So we've got the inciting incident right up against the complication. Now we're in our rising action.
He said his van broke down. He's just around the corner on the freeway, off the lodge. He just needs a jump. And give me a couple. I said, okay. Maybe this time I'll do the guy a favor. So he gets in the car with me, drive around. It was actually a van. So, okay, the story's making a little bit more sense. We hooked up on the van. I said, okay, I got jumper cables. I figured, 30 seconds, I'm going on with my life. Raise the hood of my car. He gets in the van. He fools around. Nothing's happening with the van, even with the cable club. So we're sitting there for a while trying to get the car started. Finally, he says, you tried to start the van. I'll take her under the hood while you try to start the van. Because I know the van.
So, rising action. We go over, we're at the car. The climax, you can hear it, yeah? The audience tells you, why don't you go in the van? I'll tinker under the hood. Whole audience goes, oh boy. Like, we are in the moment of tension now. And I would argue that in this story, that moment of tension is heightened because we know that the car's going to get stolen. In the first story, we didn't know how the haircut would turn out. So we're tense because it could go either way. This time, the second he says that, we know where we are. We're in the climax of this story.
I should be able to start. I'm a little leery, but the hood's up on my car. It's got jumper cable on it. I figured, look at that. So, running line service drive, I'm trying to, turn the key in the van. And as I look down, it's not really a key. It's a screwdriver. In the ignition of the van.
The reversal, right? That's the moment where it becomes clear that not everything is right, that this is not clean, doesn't make sense. Why is there no key? The moment where even the storyteller becomes aware that something's up, that they are in a situation that is probably not going to go very well. Again, what's great about audio storytelling, and we'll really listen to this next week, is how much the audience can tell you. So if you're going to tell a story in this medium, you're probably going to practice a lot, right? Maybe with whoever you are in the house with right now. Before you tell them what your climax is, listen to the reaction, because I bet they will tell you, and it might not even be what you think it is. but the audience will tell you. So the reversal, screwdriver.
I'm a little suspicious, but you know. He offered me a couple dollars.
So the reversal, we call right back to the complication, right? I have to be okay with this because he gave me a couple dollars. That was the complication that led to me being part of the story in the first place.
So then he gets very concerned. He says, these people sure are flying up the service drive. Maybe you better pull your car off to the side while we try to figure out what's wrong with the bed. So he says, you take the cables off and I'll move your car. I'm outside the car. I said, okay. So take the cables off. I see my car going northbound on this line.
So by the way, I think you could argue, hey Nina, I think this is the reversal, is the moment where the car goes driving away. And that's definitely possible. I think because this is an audio format, I would go with the reversal being where the audience tells us it is. In this case, the loudest reaction was at the lack of a key, right? You could certainly argue that the climax is actually when he realizes that the guy doesn't have the car key, that he has a screwdriver, and that the reversal is when the guy drives away. It's certainly possible, written out, it might sound like that. And if you perform it one night, it might be reacted to like that. For the sake of this performance, I think we go with the audience's reaction for things, right? It's sort of that idea of as a writer, you can decide what your story's about, but if everybody reads it and tells you it's about something else, it might be about that thing too. For the sake of this version of this story, I think we go with the audience, right? Their reactions, which is not to say that they're not having a reaction here, but I would say we're in the falling action now. We're in the car being taken part of the story.
He makes it all the way to the forest entrance to the live freeway. South puts the hood down. Now, please do recover the car a few weeks later, minus the catalytic converter. Yeah. The aluminum wheels. Even take the visors off from, the block the sun. But I got the last.
So, falling action, resolution, right? The police found the car. It just had nothing in it. That's the resolution. He doesn't get the car back in one piece. He doesn't chase after the guy. The police find it, and there's nothing in it.
Yeah. Thanks to President Obama and cash for plumbers. I traded it in. Got the 4,500.
So, I would argue that cash for clunkers moment is the denouement. It's way after the action of this story. This happened. It was all fine. But you could say it was the resolution too. So what I'm hoping the second story in particular showed is that even if something fits into this very particular narrative structure model, there's room for disagreement. There's room for my opinion about what the denouement is versus the resolution, and your opinion on what the resolution is versus what the denouement is. It isn't an exact science, because storytelling is not an exact science, right? And like I said, the thing about audio story is the reaction is going to be different probably every time. You might think that the climax is this moment, you're set on it, you know it is, you wrote it that way, but when you start speaking, the audience actually realizes what's about to happen before you thought they would, and they react in a certain way, and you realize, oh, that's the climax, that's the point of the most tension in a piece. It's not that you need to be a stickler for this, yeah? And it's not that you can't play around with it. But when people talk about a story, particularly a piece of audible narrative, and they talk about it being really clean and tight, they mean that it fits this, that it has a structure to it, that there are rules of the story. And then they just get to sit back and experience it and enjoy it. as you can really hear from people listening to that. I would say that, you know, if you hear a story that goes on too long, or a story that has no point, or any sort of criticism you might give a story, you can actually look and say, like, okay, well, if a story goes on too long, what does that mean? Does that mean that I took too long to get to the climax of the story, right? That my exposition went on unnecessarily? And then you can say, okay, well, if that's the case, what are the actual facts I need my audience to know to get into the story? Because maybe I thought they had to know all of these things, but I can actually isolate it down to, I am from Detroit. I'm not easily tricked. Maybe I don't need to explain more. I don't need to explain how in 5th grade somebody tricked me and then I got really smart about it. I can just say this one thing. I can make it clean and clear. Or on the other hand, maybe your falling action is going on way too long. Maybe you've hit the climax, you've hit the resolution, and now you're just continuing with what happened next to the point at which the satisfaction of that moment sort of dissipates because we're so stuck in the rising, in the falling action. And I think one thing I wanted to note that I should have noted is, for the most part in these stories, the climax comes about in the middle, right? They're both about 5 minutes, and about 2 minutes, 2.5, we have the climax, which means basically we have 2.5 minutes in, 2.5 minutes out. And that's not always true. Some stories require a lot more exposition. I would argue in stand-up in particular, a lot of exposition helps land the punchline. And then the thing about stand-up is typically the resolution falling action is much shorter because you hit the punchline and you move on. Whereas with storytelling, I think it's fair to say that at least at first, you kind of want them to be even. You want your comments to come about in the middle. That gets complicated with the longer stories. And next week, we'll look at what that means, what it means if you're telling a much longer story. Sort of, do you want 5 minutes of exposition, 5 minutes of resolution? Probably not, right? So maybe you want 2 minutes of exposition, 5 minutes in rising action leading to the climax, 5 minutes leading out, and a minute in resolution. So there's a lot to play with. Don't be overwhelmed right now because the basic point is to have the structure. So look at your stories, right? Look at the ideas you came up with. I really, really urge you to come up with 3 because your first instinct might not be the actual story you have to tell. And it might be hidden within that story. Because a lot of the time, I think we start with stories that are very long. Yeah, I have a feeling the bad haircut, what if that story started when he got to school with the bad haircut and then he had to go back, right? You want to start where the story starts. So take your 3 ideas, take Freytag's pyramid, which you can, by the way, Google. It's FREYTAG' pyramid, and see what you can find and see what structural integrity you can give your story so that you can really play around with it a lot. Next week, we're going to move into the playing around phase, which specifically we're going to talk about character. So we're going to look at stories where the structure's there, the story's there, it's following that pattern, and it becomes about the characters and how they move it forward. And we're going to talk about how one serves the other. So it's important to start with this part, right? Start with the really, really nitty gritty structural stuff so that we can have a lot of freedom and a lot of fun. And I think it's important to do this stuff so that you don't have to think about it next time you're writing your story, so that it starts coming to you really naturally, which is also why I really suggest you be working on 3. And if you are putting them within this structure and then you're playing with them with characters, they will become clearer to you without you having to struggle too much and try and control your story too much. And then you get this really lovely sort of natural storytelling that we saw in those examples. So take your 3 stories, look at Freytag's pyramid, see what you can do. And I look forward to talking about character with you guys next week. All right. Thanks so much. Bye.